In this video, we'll solve in detail all the questions from Reading Academic Test 1, Section 2 from Cambridge Book 19. Let's start. The heading of the passage is The Pirates of Ancient Mediterranean. Let's start by understanding some basic words from the heading and subheading. Pirates are people who attack and rob ships, and piracy is the act of attacking and robbing ships. Nowadays, however, the word pirated and piracy are more commonly used to talk about stolen content like movies, music, or software. However, in this passage, the words pirates and piracy have nothing to do with stealing digital content. It's all about real pirates from history who attacked ships on the sea. Mediterranean is a large sea between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Ancient means a long time ago. So, ancient Mediterranean refers to the Mediterranean area or the Mediterranean region from a very long time ago. You actually don't need to know these details to solve the reading. You just need to know that Mediterranean refers to a region. Millennium means 1,000 years. Millennia is a plural of millennium. BCE means before Common Era. If we start from the year 0 and if we keep going forward, it's Common Era and the time before that is BCE. So when we talk about first and second millennia BCE, we are counting backwards from 0. So we're talking about 2000 to 1 BCE. Once again, it's enough for us to know that we are talking about ancient times, we are talking about times thousands of years ago. A lot of these basic concepts we need to know just enough so that we can ignore them while doing our readings. If we don't know them at all, sometimes it becomes a problem when we are trying to solve the reading. To pursue means to follow or chase someone in order to catch them. So, pursuers are people who are chasing someone. Here, pursuers are people who are trying to catch the pirates. Another thing to understand is that sometimes at the bottom of the reading passage, you'll see a small star. It's called an asterisk. This is to explain a word. So there is a word followed by its definition or explanation. In this passage, we have the word caravels. You will not get any question which will have answer from this part of the passage. For the purpose of finding answers, you don't need to understand the whole meaning of caravel. Just knowing that it is a type of ship is enough. So, in the passage, this means before the invention of a particular type of ship in the 15th century. That is enough for us. But improving vocabulary is always helpful. So, let's understand the meaning of this. Maneuver means to guide or move something carefully. Anything that is maneuverable is easy to move or control. This means caravel is a small ship that could be controlled easily, and it was made by the Portuguese. Let's now look at the questions that we have. In IELTS reading, it is really important to know the different question types. It helps us to find the answers quickly, and it helps us decide which question type to do first so that we are able to manage our time well. For this passage, we have three question types. First, which paragraph contains the information? This question type is known as matching information. Second, multiple choice questions or MCQs. And the third question type is gap fill questions or complete the information questions. We always try to do that question type first, which is easiest to locate in the passage. So if we look at these questions, the gap fill questions, we can see the word Rome. We can also see the word slaves. So we'll start with these questions first and we'll do the others later. I'll talk a little more about how to decide which question type to do first at the end of this video. Let's start. The first thing we do is try to get a tentative location of the answers in the passage. So I have two words in mind, Rome and slaves. Slaves are people who are forced to work without pay and they have no freedom. In the past, slaves were often taken from one country to another on ships. I'm assuming that is what this is about. On your screen, you can see paragraphs A, F, and G of the passage. The word Rome is mentioned in the first paragraph, paragraph A. But in paragraph F, I can also see the mention of the word slaves. So I'll start looking for the answers in paragraph F. Now that we have a tentative location of the answers, the next thing we do is read the question carefully and understand it. An important word here is vessels. Vessels means boats or ships. But the word vessels also has other meanings. It can refer to containers. It can also refer to the blood vessels in our body. But this is not what these vessels could be referring to. This means ships. I've used different colors to make it easier for you to understand the meaning of the question. The question is saying that piracy was a problem in Rome, but there were some benefits of piracy as well. An example of a benefit is that pirates brought slaves, and these slaves were important for the industries in Rome. This part does not have any blank. We can actually just use this part to understand from where to start looking for answers. In the passage, we can see that industries are mentioned here. So, most probably, the answer will come after this. After this, the question means that there were these benefits, but there were also attacks on vessels or on ships. So, this means there were attacks on vessels by pirates transporting something. So, what was being transported on the ships that the pirates attacked? And these attacks resulted in calls for something. Calls means a demand for something by the general public. When lots of people are asking for something, or when maybe the government representatives are asking for something, we can say that there was a call for this. We are expecting the answers to 24th and 25th question to be between this part. So we'll focus on this part first. Pirate attacks on grain ships which were essential to Roman citizens, so which is referring to the grains that were essential, led to angry voices or led to call in the Senate or in the parliament or among the government representatives demanding punishment for the culprits. So the attacks on vessels transporting what? Vessels means ships. Here, grain ship means ships transporting grain. So, vessels transporting grain. This is the answer. As a result of these attacks, there were calls by the Senate, and the calls were for punishment. The culprits mentioned here mean criminals or someone who is at fault of something. Here, the culprits are the pirates who have attacked the grain ships. So, we have two of the answers now. Moving on to the next question. Let's understand this part of the question now. Nevertheless, piracy continued. So there were calls for arrest of these pirates. Still, piracy continued, with some pirates demanding something for the return of Roman officials they captured. The pirates captured or took prisoner some Roman officials, and then they asked for something in return. So the pirates could be asking for money, they could be asking for some other facilities from the government to release or to return the officials they had kidnapped. Let's look at the passage now. This is where we got answers to the 24th and 25th question. The answer to the 26th question has to be after this. So let's focus on this part. Rome, however, did nothing. So this part corresponds to nevertheless, piracy continued. By this year, emboldened pirates. Emboldened means something who has become more bold or more confident. So these pirates kidnapped Roman dignitaries, Roman officials, and they asked for a large ransom to be paid. So, what were the pirates demanding? They were demanding a large ransom. Ransom means money that is demanded for return of someone. So, when someone is kidnapped, when the kidnappers ask for money to return that person, that money is known as ransom. Now, here comes an important thing. The instructions on top of the questions is we can choose one word only. If the instruction had been choose no more than two words, large ransom would have been a correct answer, even ransom would have been a correct answer. But because the instructions say one word only, if you write large ransom as your answer, it would be marked incorrect. The answer is ransom. With this, we are done with three of the questions and we found all the answers from one paragraph. Now we start with the multiple choice questions. We have two multiple choice questions, but we have to choose two correct options for each of them. So total of four questions. So for multiple choice questions as well, we try to figure out the tentative location of the answers in the passage before we read the question thoroughly. There are no capitalized words in this question, but we have the word inhabitants. So, inhabitants of the Mediterranean region means the people who live there or the residents of the Mediterranean region. Sometimes words from options also help. Even though these options could be incorrect, they could be mentioned in the same paragraph where we have our answers. The word authorities is mentioned here, which means the government, and farming is also mentioned. So these are some words I can keep in mind when trying to figure out the location of the answers. For this question, Greece is mentioned in the question, but these two words, which are capitalized and in italics, they can help us figure out the location of the answer in the passage. In the passage, Iliad and Odyssey are mentioned only in paragraph E. So we can be sure that we'll find the answers to the 22nd and 23rd question from this paragraph. And most probably the answer to these two should be before the answer to the 22nd and 23rd question. So I start looking for these words before paragraph E. Inhabitants are mentioned in paragraph B, but agriculture and farmers are mentioned in paragraphs F and G. We will look for answers in paragraph B. And I was able to figure this out because I started reading the beginning of every paragraph, trying to understand what is being talked about in that paragraph. So, if we are able to figure out some location keywords from the question, as we were able to do in the case of our gap fill questions, That is the best way to locate the answer in the passage. And we were able to do the same for questions 22 and 23 with the two words Iliad and Odyssey. But figuring out the location to these two questions was slightly trickier. In such cases, I start reading the beginning of every paragraph, and it gives some idea about what that paragraph is talking about. Let's start looking for the answers now. For multiple choice questions, I try to go through the options first, understand them enough so that I know what kind of information I'm looking for in the paragraph. To really understand multiple choice questions, we have to understand why the correct options are the correct options and also why the incorrect options are the incorrect options. So let's start going through the paragraph, understand what is being said and how it corresponds to the options that we have. So this is the paragraph we are working on. These are the choices we have. Out of these, two are correct. And these are meanings of some of the words from the paragraph. Let's start. While the Mediterranean region is predominantly fertile, that is, it is mostly good for growing plants, some parts are rough and full of hills and mountains. In the ancient times, the inhabitants of these areas relied mainly on marine resources. That is, the inhabitants, that is, the people who lived there, depended a lot on resources related to sea, like fish, minerals, etc. The fertile part of the sentence refers to farming, that is, growing of crops. These sentences tell us that in ancient times, the inhabitants of that area depended mainly on marine resources or the resources related to sea. So they did not depend mainly on farming or crops. Option D is they depended more on the sea for their livelihood than on farming. And that is correct. We got this from the first two sentences of the paragraph. Let's move on. Most had their own boats. From this, we are able to figure out that A is an incorrect option because the option here says they often used stolen vessels to carry out pirate attacks. Vessels means ships. This is something we discussed before also when doing these questions. Vessels means boats or ships. The word vessels has other meanings also, but in the context of this passage, the meaning is ships. And even when looking for answers to questions 24 to 26, we had come across the word vessels. Option A says that the inhabitants often used stolen vessels for pirate attacks, whereas this part says that most of the inhabitants had their own boats or their own vessels. I'm not going into the details of the rest of the sentence because we do not have any answer from that. But meanings of some of the words from these sentences are there on your screen. I hope you'll be able to figure out the meaning of the sentences. Let's read on. Geography itself further benefited the pirates. So, geography is the location of a place and the features of the place, whether it is a plain area or hilly area, etc. With the numerous coves along the coast providing places for them to hide their boats and strike undetected. Coves are small sheltered areas like small caves. So, what this says is that there were a lot of coves along the coast where the pirates could hide their boats. This option here says they, that is, the inhabitants or the pirates, stored many of the goods taken in pirate attacks in coves along the coastline. So, what they are saying is that many of the things that they stole in pirate attacks were stored in these small caves or in the coves. Coves along the coastline part is correct, but the inhabitants, who did turn to piracy sometimes, according to this passage, used these coves not for storing stolen goods but for hiding their boats. From this, we can figure out that E is also incorrect. Option C says merchant ships means ships which had cargo, which had trading goods that were being transported. Now, this says that the inhabitants or the pirates paid someone to get information about where the merchant ships would go. Merchant ships are mentioned here, but this part actually does not have any information about what is mentioned in option C. This mentions that the merchant ships were limited to a few well known routes that they could travel on. So, that would be one reason why the pirates would not need to pay anyone. Also, it is mentioned here that the inhabitants or the pirates had good knowledge about the coastline, which is mostly where the merchant ships were. So it is written here that most inhabitants had their own boats and they had unsurpassed knowledge of the local coastline. That is, they had knowledge that is better than anyone else's. It is nowhere clearly mentioned whether they did or did not pay anyone. That itself would mean that C is an incorrect option. And it is also implied when it is mentioned that the inhabitants had very good knowledge about the coastline and merchant ships were following routes along the coastline. We just have one option left. Let's read it. They managed to escape capture by the authorities because they knew the area so well. Authorities are the government. Escape capture is to avoid being caught. So the inhabitants or the pirates were able to avoid getting caught by the government because they knew the area well. The last sentence of the paragraph clearly mentions knowledge of the local area helped the pirates to avoid retaliation once a state fleet arrived. State fleet is the official ships, that is, the ships of the government. So, when the ships of the government arrived, the pirates were able to avoid getting caught, they were able to run away, get away because they knew the area very well. So B is the correct answer. The two correct answers are B and D. A very important part throughout when looking for these two answers was that the word mentioned in the question is inhabitants. Inhabitants are also mentioned in the beginning of the paragraph. But soon after, pirates are mentioned again and again. So one may get confused that are we talking about the same people? Yes, we are, because this sentence starting with thus says, thus it is not surprising that during hardships, that is, during difficult times, these men, that is, the inhabitants, turned to piracy. So they became pirates when they had difficult times. This is why throughout, when pirates are mentioned, we are talking about inhabitants. Let's start with the next set of questions, the 22nd and 23rd questions. With Iliad and Odyssey being mentioned, we were able to figure out which paragraph the answers are expected to be from. Now let's go through the options a little and try to see what is mentioned in the paragraph. Once again, we are looking for the correct options, obviously, but we are also trying to understand why the incorrect options are the incorrect options. Let's start. The ancient Greek world's experience of piracy was different from the Egyptian rulers, not connected to anything mentioned in the choices that we have. While Egypt's power was land based, the ancient Greeks relied on the Mediterranean in almost all aspects of life, from trade to warfare. What we get from here is that the ancient Greeks, that is what the question is about, depended on the Mediterranean Sea a lot for all areas of life, from buying things, from selling things, wars, etc. Interestingly, in his works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, so Greek writer Homer wrote Iliad and Odyssey. In Iliad and Odyssey, he condones, that is, he accepts the life of pirates. He also praises the life of pirates, that is, he talks good things about it, and he admires the lifestyle and the actions of pirates. Whenever you come across any difficult words in your reading test that you don't understand, before you look for the meaning of those words, see if from the context you would be able to understand the meaning. For example, if you do not know the meaning of the word condones, but you understand the meaning of the word praises, you can get an idea that this is also a positive word. So, Homer is talking positive things about the pirates. The opinion remained unchanged in the following centuries. So, for hundreds of years afterwards, the opinion regarding pirates remained unchanged. That is, for hundreds of years after Iliad and Odyssey were written, people still thought piracy was good. The option B says attitudes towards piracy changed shortly after, that is, soon after, Iliad and Odyssey were written. The attitudes or the opinions, as mentioned in the passage, did not change at all. Iliad and Odyssey say piracy is good, and for hundreds of years after that, the opinion was unchanged. It was not changed, which means B is incorrect. The ancient Greek historian glorified pirates. Glorified also means to say good things about someone, but in such a way that you make it seem even better. So, another example is being given that pirates and their adventurous and their bold attacks were talked about in a good way. Option E says a favorable view of piracy is evident in certain ancient Greek texts. The historian is talking about good things, and before that, even Iliad and Odyssey are talking about good things. So, from all of this, we get that yes, a favorable view or a positive view or a positive opinion of piracy can be seen in the texts or books or works of ancient Greek writers. For Greeks, piracy was a part of everyday life. Option A says the state estimated that very few people were involved in piracy. The state here means the government. So the government thought that very few people were involved in piracy. But the passage says that piracy was a part of everyday life. And even before this, the passage mentioned that ancient Greeks relied on Mediterranean in all aspects of life. So relying on Mediterranean does not mean that there was piracy. Sea routes and ships could be used without piracy, but we get a hint of it from here, and even from here we get an idea that piracy was a part of everyday life. And besides this, nowhere is it mentioned what the government said, that very few people were involved in piracy or a lot of people were involved. Specifically, it is not mentioned, it is just mentioned that it was a part of everyday life. So, option A is also incorrect. Even high ranking members of the state were not beyond engaging in such activities. Such activities is piracy. High ranking members of the state are important government officers. Engaging here means to take part in something. What this sentence tells us is that even some government officers were participating in piracy. Option C says important officials were known to occasionally take part in piracy. Yes, they were. And the next sentence gives an example of some ambassadors or some officers changing their route from official travel and capturing a ship. Capturing a ship means piracy. The Greeks' liberal approach, that is, flexible and open minded attitude towards piracy, does not mean they always tolerated it. So it is mentioned here that piracy was not always tolerated or accepted. But the option D says every citizen thought pirate attacks were unacceptable. This is incorrect because some people may have disliked piracy, but it was a part of everyday life. Even some officers were a part of it. The writers of that time were writing good things about it. So we cannot say that every citizen was saying bad things about piracy. So the only two options which are correct are C and E. Now we are left with just one question type, that is match the information. I'm choosing to do this question type at the end because it is better to do those questions first which have answers in the same order as the information in the text and which have some obvious location keywords such as Iliad and Odyssey or Rome and slaves. After doing the other questions, I'm a little familiar with the passage and I've read some paragraphs pretty thoroughly. All of that can help in this question type. This is a very important instruction to note. You may use any letter more than once. We have 7 paragraphs A to G and only 6 questions. And even then, more than one question can have the same answer. To attempt this question, first I go through all the questions and understand them. I try to understand what kind of information I'm looking for. Whenever the question mentions a reference or a mention, it means that we could just have a slight mention about it in the passage. Maybe there is only one sentence about the whole thing. But if the question says details of something or explanation of something, we expect more content about it in the paragraph. Let's start reading the questions now. A reference to a denial of involvement in piracy. Denial means saying no to something. So, denial of involvement in piracy means someone is saying that he or she is not involved in piracy. This tells me that most probably there will be a name of someone or maybe name of a country in the paragraph where this is mentioned. Details of how a campaign to eradicate piracy was carried out. So, details of how someone tried to end piracy. This I know is not in the beginning. While doing the other questions, I've already seen that at least till paragraph E, and even after that, piracy in the ancient world is mentioned and it is mentioned in a positive way. A mention of the circumstances in which states, that is, the government, in the ancient world would make use of pirates. There is some mention of this in paragraphs B and E, again something we saw while doing the other questions. A reference to how people today commonly view pirates. This could be at the beginning or at the end. And the reason I know this is that the whole passage is about piracy in ancient world. Any reference to how things are today or how things could be in the future should be in the beginning or at the end. So that is where I'll first look for this answer. An explanation of how some people were encouraged not to return to piracy. So this is about ending of piracy. It's not something I have come across while doing any of the other questions. A mention of the need for many sailing vessels, that is, many sailing ships or boats, to stay relatively close to land. Again, in B and E, there is some mention of coast, coastline, and land. While looking for this answer, I will glance at these paragraphs first. When doing this question type, I go through each of the statements, understand what the statement is saying. If I've done the other question types first, I may have some reference to where the answer could be. So I keep that in mind as well. While doing the other questions, I found answers in paragraphs B, E, and F. Even though I have done both the other question types, there are many paragraphs I have not gone through at all. Those are the paragraphs I'll focus on first when looking for the answers to these questions. Let us start. The 14th question is about someone denying involvement in piracy. So when I was first reading the questions, I mentioned that this means I'll keep in mind that a name could be mentioned because a person would be denying involvement in piracy. In the passage, here we have names of a sea, then Mediterranean region is mentioned, which is what the whole passage is about. Names are mentioned in paragraph D. There are a lot of capitalized words here. Some names are mentioned in paragraph E as well, but because I've gone through this while looking for answers 22 and 23, I know this does not mention a denial of involvement in piracy. These are names of writers. One name is mentioned in paragraph G, but if I glance at it, this is about ending piracy. So I focus on paragraph D. Simple meanings to a lot of words from the paragraph are on your screen. I will focus on the part of the paragraph that is directly relevant to the question. First, the names of two pirate groups are mentioned, and later it says that the king of Alasia rejected claims of a connection with Luca. Luca is one of the pirate groups. So the king is saying, I'm not involved with a pirate group. Rejected claims means denied, connection means involvement, and Luca is a pirate group. So the answer to the 14th question is D. The 15th question says, details of how a campaign to eradicate piracy was carried out. A campaign is some planned activities to do something, and eradicate means to completely end something. So we are looking for details of how someone tried to end piracy. While doing the other questions, I have seen that the middle passages from B to E or B to F are mainly giving details of piracy in ancient times. In some places, it is also mentioned how the government of that time was also in favor of piracy or it was using pirates. There are some references that everyone was not in favor of piracy, but there is no mention of any planned activities being done by the government or by anyone else to end piracy. That is all the information I have. So, what I do is I read the first sentence of any paragraphs where I think the answer could be. Here in paragraphs F and G, there is a mention of dealing with piracy and then a mention of pirates had outlived their usefulness. Both of these seem to refer to some kind of negative attitude towards piracy. So I'll focus on these two paragraphs. In paragraph F, there is a mention of how piracy was a serious issue, but then it is also mentioned that the government profited from pirates a lot. And this sentence, Rome, however, did nothing. So, Rome here refers to the government of Rome. They did not do anything further encouraging piracy. So, nothing was done, piracy was encouraged. Let's look at paragraph G now. Outlived means having lived for longer than required. So, pirates or piracy was no longer useful to the government of Rome. Combat means to fight something. Mediterranean menace. Menace means something which is a threat or a danger. So, Mediterranean menace refers to the piracy. The menace or the danger in the Mediterranean region at that time is referring to piracy. This paragraph gives details of how there was a new law which gave a lot of funds, a lot of money to end piracy. The region was divided into different districts. So, these are all the details. Campaign means a concerted action, eradicate piracy. The entire Mediterranean was free of pirates. So, the answer to the 15th question is G. The 16th question says a mention of the circumstances in which states in the ancient world would make use of pirates. States refer to governments. In the passage, the government or the authorities or the state is mentioned a few times. The answer to this question was also comparatively easy to find because the answer comes from the very first sentence of the paragraph, so that helps a lot. Having said that, there is a mention of state fleet in paragraph B, but this is about state fleet trying to catch the pirates. One paragraph which could confuse you is paragraph E. There is a mention of some high ranking members of the state engaging in piracy, and then there is an example of an ambassador capturing a ship. So there could be a confusion between paragraph C and E, but E mentions that some members of the government were doing piracy. C clearly mentions that the government was using pirates for their own benefit. States would make use of pirates, governments resort to pirate services, employing their skills, using their skill. The answer to the 16th question is C. The 17th question says a mention to how people today commonly view pirates. When I had first read the question, I had mentioned that because today is mentioned, I will first look for the answer either at the beginning of the passage or at the end of the passage, because the whole passage is about ancient times, very old times. So, the probability is that if there is any mention of the present or the future, it should be at the beginning or at the end, in the introduction or in the conclusion of the passage. We have already gone through the last paragraph while doing the 15th question. This was all about ending piracy in ancient times. The only reference we have to the present is in the first sentence of the passage. And even here, we do not have any synonyms of the word today, but present tense is used. So it says, when one mentions pirates, that means mentions them today, an image springs to mind. So a picture is formed in our mind of these kind of people, people who are outsiders, who are dangerous, etc. And then from the very next sentence, ancient times are mentioned. So there is just a quick reference to how people today think of pirates or commonly view pirates. The answer to the 17th question is A. The 18th question says an explanation of how some people were encouraged not to return to piracy. So this means there were some pirates who stopped being pirates, and then what was done, most probably by the government, so that these people do not go back to piracy. While doing the 15th question, we had seen that paragraph G is the only paragraph where there is a mention of the government fighting piracy, the government trying to end piracy. Towards the end of this paragraph, it is mentioned many more were offered land in fertile areas located far from the sea. What this sentence says is that when there was a process or a campaign to end pirates, many pirates died. But as a long term solution, many more, that means many more pirates, were given land by the government where they could do farming. So instead of pirates, Rome got farmers. This is how people were encouraged not to return to piracy. I was expecting a slightly longer explanation, maybe some more details of this, because the question says explanation. But this is the only paragraph in the whole passage where ending of piracy is mentioned. The 19th question says, a mention of the need of many sailing vessels to stay relatively close to land. Vessels means boats or ships. This is something we have discussed before in this video. We are looking for some reason why some ships or some boats would need to stay close to land. When I had read this question, I had a vague memory that while doing some other questions, I had read the word land. So that is where I went first. But here it is mentioned that in Egypt, land based things were important, were powerful. But in Greece, the Mediterranean Sea was very important. So it is just a mention of two places. It is a mention of land based versus sea based things. It is not about vessels or ships staying close to land. Paragraph B has a lot of mention of coast and coastline. So, this is the paragraph we'll look at now. The beginning of the paragraph refers to the beginning of piracy. It also mentions how people of that time became pirates during hard times and they had very good knowledge of that area. It is after this part that details of this knowledge is given. Let's focus on this part. Here it is mentioned that there were many small caves along the coastline, that is, along the land next to sea, where there were places for pirates to hide their boats or hide their vessels. The answer, however, comes from this part. This is referring to how in the ancient times, most of the ships, this most is referring to the ships referred to in the previous sentence. Most ships were restricted to few well known navigable routes that followed the coastline. Followed the coastline means stayed relatively close to land. Many sailing vessels are many ships. And the reason for that, or the need for that, is that ships could not easily cross long distances over open water. The answer to the 19th question is, as you can see, this instruction, you may use any letter more than once, is very important. With this, we are done with all the questions. And having done them, let's once again talk about how to decide which question types to do first. You need to be very familiar with the question types so that you are able to manage your time well in your reading. Some questions have answers in the same order as the information in the text. Gap fill questions have answers in the same order. Multiple choice questions have answers in the same order. Usually, I try to do these questions first. Now, I say usually because a large part of trying to find answers quickly is to be able to locate answers in the passage quickly. Even if the answers are in order, but if I cannot locate them quickly, I will end up spending a lot of time on that question. So here comes the importance of location keywords. Location keywords are words which help us get the tentative location of the answer in the passage. Capitalized words are very helpful in this. Numbers also help. And sometimes there are other words like slaves in this case, which may also help. In this case, I chose to do these questions first because I was able to locate where the answers were, and all the answers of these questions were within one paragraph. After that, I did multiple choice questions. The reasons were again similar. I was able to locate where the answers were in the passage, and after that, I focused on that paragraph. Multiple choice questions are certainly a little time consuming. In multiple choice questions, usually all the options that are given in the question are mentioned in the passage in some way or the other. So we cannot just look for a mention of the words and then think that could be the correct answer. We need to understand the options, and we need to understand why the correct options are the correct options, and also sometimes why the incorrect options are the incorrect options. The process of elimination when attempting multiple choice questions. This is the question type I chose to do last because in this question type, statements are mentioned and I have to find out where the answer could be in the passage. So, because I'd done the other questions first, I was a little familiar with the passage. Even then, when you're doing this question type or any other question type, if you feel stuck, if you cannot find where the answer is, try reading the beginning of every paragraph. Sometimes from there itself, we are able to understand where the answer could be. And if required, read the beginning and end of every paragraph. That's it for now. I hope this video helped you. Do like, share, subscribe. So bye for now. All the very best.